Ever since its earlier incarnation as the Garden of Clear Ripples, the Summer Palace has been the setting for many important events, some personal, some of national and international importance. Following the founding of New China in 1949, the Summer Palace underwent major repairs. What new stories did the renovation uncover? To find out, please watch the 11th and final part of Untold Stories from the Summer Palace.
The focal point of the buildings on the front side of Longevity Hill at the Summer Palace is the Pavilion of Buddhist Fragrance. To the south, the pavilion commands a panoramic view of the 17-arch bridge on Lake Kunming, and beyond that, the lake's west embankment. Further to the south, there are fields stretching into the distance. To the west, Jade Spring Hill, the Western Hills, and the Imperial Gardens form a scenic whole in a masterpiece of classical Chinese landscape gardening. But by the mid-20th century, in the early years of the People's Republic of China, the Pavilion of Buddhist Fragrance was in a state of disrepair. In 1953, the pavilion was comprehensively restored for the first time since the late Qing dynasty. The wooden frame, which had been tilting at a 6-degree angle, was adjusted. The missing tiles were replaced. The golden dragons and royal seals were repainted, and on those parts of the building where they had previously been gold foil, it was replaced. For the next 30 years, the building did not suffer any leaks, and even the violent Tangshan earthquake of 1976 failed to damage it, apart from dislodging a single panel from the eaves. Other parts of the Summer Palace also underwent extensive renovation. The Garden of Virtuous Harmony, the Hall for Listening to Orioles, the Hall of Emptiness, and the Hall of Dispelling Clouds. By 1958, no music had been heard in the Garden of Virtuous Harmony for 50 years, since the death of Empress Dowager Cixi. But in that year, some of Beijing's leading art troupes began performing in the theatre there. One of the most famous landmarks at the Summer Palace is the 728-meter long corridor. The longest painted corridor in the world, it is renowned for the 14,000 paintings on its beams and crossbeams. However, after half a century of neglect, the paint had begun peeling away and many of the pictures had faded. In 1959, a major renovation of the long corridor was initiated. Previously, details of how the long corridor was painted had been passed on by word of mouth among the craftsmen responsible. The advantage of this was that they were able to work with a relatively free hand. However, it also meant that no draft drawings existed of their work. This made it difficult to employ the original techniques and reproduce the paintings in their original form. But then, a worker from the Summer Palace during a trip to Hangzhou had a brainwave. Knowing that the paintings in the long corridor had been based on the scenery of the south, he brought a tourist map back with him, and by referring to it, artists were able to reproduce the scenery of Hangzhou's West Lake in the long corridor. The finest craftsmen were brought in from all over the country to restore and refresh the paintings, and eventually the long corridor recovered the charm for which it had been celebrated 50 years before. Over the following years, more work was done. Most of the paintings we see today date from 1978. In December 1990, Lake Kunming became the focus of a massive project. Lake Kunming had been one of the most beautiful features of the Summer Palace ever since the reign of Emperor Qianlong. But 240 years had passed, and vast quantities of silt had accumulated in it. As a result, the lake contained significantly less water. In February 1982, it had even dried up completely. In November 1990, the Beijing municipal government set about dredging Lake Kunming. However, it was winter, and before the dredging machinery could begin operation, the lake needed to be cleared of ice. For a 20-day period, 180,000 volunteers broke the ice by hand. Then, in the course of the next 2 months, silt was removed from an area of 1.2 square kilometers of the lake. By the time the task was completed, the lake was 57 centimeters deeper. On March the 10th, 1991, Lake Kunming was filled with water once again. The clear water that had earned the Summer Palace its former name of Qingyi Yuan, Garden of Clear Ripples, had returned. The winding west embankment of Lake Kunming was modelled on the Su Causeway of West Lake in Hangzhou. Renovation work in the western area of the Summer Palace saw the lake's west embankment once again, after a hiatus of 130 years, resemble the landscape of southern China. In 1991, to the southwest of Lake Kunming, 3 two-story buildings returned after a long absence. Known collectively as the Jingming houses, they had originally been built in the early days of Qingyi Yuan, designed according to a painting by the Yuan dynasty artist Zhao Mengfu. In 1860, however, the Anglo-French Allied Army had burned the buildings down. The new Jingming houses, built a century later, became a popular spot for enjoying the sights of the garden in the warmth of spring.
Ever since its earlier incarnation as the Garden of Clear Ripples, The Summer Palace has been the setting for many important events, some personal, some of national and international importance. Following the founding of New China in 1949, the Summer Palace underwent major repairs. What new stories did the renovation uncover? To find out, please watch the 11th and final part of Untold Stories from the Summer Palace.
There are areas of the Summer Palace where the beauty is less exquisite and more natural. The rear side of Longevity Hill is, in the architectural styles of its buildings and the designs of its plantations, very different from the front. A number of pine trees stand on the front side of the hill. Their green foliage sets off the splendour and grandeur of the palaces. Most of the trees on the rear of the hill are pines too, but there are also cypresses, maples, Chinese scholar trees, peach trees and apricot trees. Beneath them, the ground is covered with flowers and bushes. Compared with the front of the hill, the beauty of the scenery on the rear is more natural. The rear side of the hill, because it receives less sunshine, is on average 1 degree cooler than the front. The difference is especially noticeable in the summer. Here, in the cool and gentle humidity, it's easy to feel comfortable and at peace. The rear side of the hill also retains aspects of the old Qingyi Yuan destroyed by fire in 1860. Empress Dowager Cixi had to abandon plans to restore the buildings on this side of the hill due to a shortage of funds. Since the 1980s, however, restoring the buildings on the rear side of the hill has been a focus of the restoration work at the Summer Palace. Those who enter the garden through the North Palace Gate and climb the hill can enjoy a number of different sights, but ultimately they reach a complex of Tibetan Buddhist-style buildings standing in an open space. These are the Katadvipa, representing the 4 inhabited continents of the universe in Buddhism. These buildings have been left in ruins for over 120 years after the Anglo-French allies burnt them down in 1860. But in the 1980s, work began to restore them. In the autumn of 1990, another traditional feature of Longevity Hill was restored after a 100-year absence. Commercial Street had previously been known as Suzhou Street since it was modelled after Shantang Street in the city of Suzhou. Emperor Qianlong had first set eyes on the street during one of his tours of the south. The creation of a copy of Suzhou's Shantang Street at Qingyi Yuan had been a gift from the emperor to his mother. With the street, she could enjoy the lifestyle of southern China without ever having to leave the capital. Today, Commercial Street is a place where tourists can contemplate China's rich history and culture, and also get a sense of one of the pleasures the emperor and his mother once experienced in their garden. The northwestern section of the Summer Palace is an area where people can connect with nature and experience the pleasure of living in the countryside. This unique scenic spot, once an important part of Qingyi Yuan, is called farming and weaving. The scenic area known as farming and weaving takes its name from a series of paintings which were in turn inspired by the traditions of the southern Song dynasty 1,000 years ago. The paintings date from the reigns of Emperor Kangxi, Yongzheng and Qianlong in the late 17th and 18th centuries. This was a time when the court derived a significant part of its income from taxes levied on farmers and weavers. When farming and weaving was laid out for Qingyi Yuan, the designers copied the paintings. The area was established in the year 1750. The following year, the Bureau of Weaving and Dyeing under the Office of the Imperial Household relocated here from Dianmen in Beijing. 13 silkworm breeding families also moved there from Yuan Mingyuan. Every 9th month by the lunar calendar, the Bureau of Weaving and Dyeing would offer sacrifices in the silkworm god temple. The farming and weaving area is testament to the fact that at the time, farming and silkworm raising were the foundation of the national economy. In 1860, farming and weaving was destroyed by the Anglo-French allies. During the garden's reconstruction ordered by Empress Dowager Cixi, a wall was built around the farming and weaving area, and this left it largely cut off from the rest of the garden. The buildings in the part outside the wall were not rebuilt. But in 2003, a project was launched to restore all the buildings in the farming and weaving area. Having been left neglected for 144 years, farming and weaving was revived. The landscape has been largely restored to its original appearance as it was at the time of Qingyi Yuan.
Ever since its earlier incarnation as the Garden of Clear Ripples, the Summer Palace has been the setting for many important events, some personal, some of national and international importance. Following the founding of New China in 1949, the Summer Palace underwent major repairs. What new stories did the renovation uncover? To find out, please watch the 11th and final part of Untold Stories from the Summer Palace.
From the time of its first incarnation as Qingyi Yuan, many stories and legends about the Summer Palace have been passed down. There are enigmas such as that of the tower that was demolished to be replaced with a pavilion that still defy explanation. And new legends are still being created, such as one concerning the Pavilion of Buddhist Fragrance. On the eve of National Day in 1989, the Pavilion of Buddhist Fragrance was ready to be reopened to the public after being renovated. However, something was missing. Originally, a bronze statue of the Goddess of Mercy with 1,000 arms had been housed in the Pavilion of Buddhist Fragrance, but in 1860 it was destroyed in the fire set by the Anglo-French army. A clay statue of the Buddha that replaced it was itself badly damaged sometime later, and so for a long time the place where the missing statue had been enshrined remained vacant. But then, news came that a huge statue of the Buddha had been discovered hidden behind the wall of an abandoned temple in Beijing's Xicheng district. It was said to be very similar to the statue that had been enshrined in the Pavilion of Buddhist Fragrance, as it was described in historical documents. The statue of the Buddha, weighing 5,000 kilos, was moved to the Pavilion of Buddhist Fragrance. 5 meters tall, it had 12 faces and 24 arms. Experts dated it back more than 400 years, significantly earlier than the history of the garden. This being the case, it was truly remarkable that the statue, in both its appearance and its size, was a perfect match for the Pavilion of Buddhist Fragrance. All that it lacked, so the experts were able to tell, was a smaller statue of the Buddha that should have stood above it. It had been lost, although the pedestal for it remained. But this is not the end of the story. Having enshrined the statue, someone thought of a small bronze Buddha that had been found by swimmers in Lake Kunming and subsequently kept in a storeroom. It seemed doubtful that the small statue would fit on the pedestal above the large Buddha. But, incredibly, it did. Since then, the 2 bronze Buddhas have been the subject of a popular story passed from mouth to mouth. This mulberry tree is 240 years old. A remarkable number of old trees like it have survived the damage done to the summer palace over the years. Today, they are part of the garden's heritage and a witness to its history. When the Summer Palace was accredited as a World Heritage Site in 1998, the World Heritage Committee commented as follows: "The Summer Palace in Beijing fully encompasses the principles of traditional Chinese landscape gardening and harmoniously integrates artificial architecture with nature. It is a manifestation of the ideas and practices of Chinese gardening, which has played such a critical role in the development of the gardening traditions and culture of the East. Chinese royal gardens, such as the Summer Palace, are strong symbols of one of the world's great civilizations." On the front side of Longevity Hill in the middle stands a stone stele that was set up in Qingyi Yuan in 1751. It bears the inscription, "Longevity Hill and Lake Kunming." In 2000, a white marble stele was erected just inside the Summer Palace's East Palace Gate. It informs visitors that the Summer Palace has been accredited as a World Heritage Site. The 2 steles stand close together in space, but they're separated in time by 249 years. Thus, they symbolize the civilization lives on, unrestricted by either time or space.
teacher's son and farmer in his native New Zealand. In China, he founded industrial cooperatives and schools. Left for dead on a European battlefield, he became a leading advocate of world peace. He devoted 60 years of his life to China. He was known as the Chinese New Zealander. He was Rui Ali.